Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our findings today. I'm very excited. This is my first conference talk and a little nervous. So, okay. So I'm going to talk about that autocentric biases depend on explicitly reasoning about others' beliefs. So when I show you a picture like this, you will probably think about what the different people in the scene have on their mind. And this ability to reason about others' mental states is referred to as theory of mind. Now, as we heard before, research indicates that already infants are influenced by what others see or believe. And we as adults are not only reasoning about what others are thinking in an explicit way, but are also involuntarily influenced by others' beliefs, even when they are not relevant to our current task. So in this experiment, for example, which was quite cited a bit in this conference, so I will keep it brief, participants were faster at detecting a ball that was surprisingly revealed behind an occluder when a bystander believed that the ball should be behind the occluder, although it had actually left the scene, compared to when the agent also knew that the ball had left. So the agent's belief modulated how quickly participants detected the ball themselves. So not only infants, but also adults show autocentric biases in their own perception or expectations of the environment from what another person sees or believes. Taken together, those infant and adult findings made it necessary to rethink previous theories on theory of mind. So previous studies had assumed that theory of mind is something that we engage in an effortful way, and that relies on explicitly inferring what the other believes in a verbal format, and therefore only develops fairly late, namely around 4 years of age, when children begin to reason explicitly about beliefs verbally, so in standard false belief tasks, whereas these new findings now seem to indicate that theory of mind occurs automatically, and even when the other is entirely irrelevant to our current task. So based on this, it was proposed that there may be two different systems for reasoning about the other's beliefs. An early developing implicit automatic system where beliefs are computed spontaneously and may interfere with our own view, and an explicit verbal system that is more effortful and develops later. So against this background, we asked whether and how autocentric biases are related to explicitly reasoning about others' beliefs. So therefore, we conducted 2 studies. So the first one with adults. Here we examined how autocentric biases are related to and modulated by explicit belief reasoning. And then one with preschoolers, where we asked how autocentric biases are related with passing standard verbal false belief tasks. So in our adult study, we conducted an online study, and 113 participants performed a search task using their mouse. I will quickly show you an example video of the procedure.
Guck mal, das Eichhörnchen.
So it's in German.
Das Eichhörnchen hat eine Nuss dabei.
The agent is hiding
Es
the
vergräbt
object.
die Nuss im Boden. Jetzt geht das Eichhörnchen zum Baum und will eine Schaufel holen. Oh, da kommt ein
And the wind is
Windstoß.
blowing
Das
the
kann das
object to location
Eichhörnchen
too.
gar nicht sehen. Der Wind weht die Nuss an einen anderen Ort. Das Eichhörnchen hat die Schaufel gefunden und kommt zurück. Jetzt bist du dran. Wo sucht das Eichhörnchen jetzt?
So before the critical question, in the end, we asked before that participants needed to do a destructor task, where they needed to click on hexagonal stars for 20 seconds under 5-pointed stars. And also we pre-registered this study and used a Bayesian sequential approach. So, so our task is based on a continuous belief reasoning task by Bernstein, the sandbox task, which we adapted. And we wanted to examine autocentric biases in this task, and then we're able to compare and relate autocentric bias measures directly to explicit belief reasoning following the original task. So in the autocentric version, we asked in the end, where is the object? And in the explicit version, we asked the critical standard question, so where the agent will look for the object. In our task, we compared then the experimental false belief condition with the control true belief condition, where the agent did see the location change. So the outcome measure in the altercentric version would be an altercentric bias in the false belief conditions, showing in a deviation from the actual location to the believed location of the agent, so influenced in the response by the agent's perspective. In the explicit belief reasoning version, an egocentric bias from the believed to the actual location would mean that the participant was influenced by the own perspective or knowledge when indicating where the agent would look for the object. So the egocentric bias would be an inverse measure for explicit belief reasoning. So the smaller the egocentric bias, the better the explicit theory of mind performance. The experiment consisted of 16 trials. We had 8 trials in the altercentric block and 8 in the egocentric block, both with each 4 false and 4 true belief trials. And the order of the trials was counterbalanced across participants, which allowed us to assess the effect of explicit belief reasoning on the altercentric bias. So what we hypothesized was a positive altercentric bias and a positive egocentric bias in the respective versions. And due to the inverse nature of the egocentric bias, we expected a negative relation between alter and egocentric biases. And also we were looking at order effects. So what we find was a positive altercentric bias in the total sample. However, when we split the sample in subgroups of participants doing the altercentric block first and participants doing the egocentric block first, we would only see an altercentric bias in participants doing the explicit belief reasoning task before the altercentric task. And we found evidence against an altercentric bias in participants starting with the altercentric block. So in terms of explicit belief reasoning, we did not find an egocentric bias, neither in the whole sample, nor when taking into account order effects. So we do not replicate the finding of the original sandbox study. And this is actually in line with other recent non-replications of the original sandbox task that resulted from our colleagues in Göttingen of the Crossing Project, for example. And further unsurprisingly, given that we did not find an egocentric bias, there was also no correlation between altercentric and egocentric bias. So yeah, to summarize, so we found only an altercentric bias in participants who had been asked to explicitly reason about the agent's belief in a previous task. And this indicates that altercentric biases may not be fully automatic, but depend on the relevance of the agent or the agent's belief in the context of the task. So as we see a dependence between altercentric biases and explicit belief reasoning in adults, the preschool age is actually a specifically interesting phase to further determine this relation, as explicit belief reasoning and passing standard false belief tasks develops in this time. This is why we conducted a second study, where we tested 54 children between 3 and 5 years, so exactly before and after the age where children start passing standard verbal false belief tasks. And in addition to the sandbox task, we acquired such a standard false belief task where children were asked in which of 2 boxes a puppet with a false belief about an object's location would search for the object. So we could classify the children as theory of mind passers and theory of mind non-passers. The data that we acquired was part of a larger ongoing study that also includes numerous other measures such as FNIRS and MRI, language, and much more, but for now we will focus on the data of the sandbox task. So, okay, with the children we actually used a live sandbox with 2 real experimenters, and equivalent to the procedure in the adult study, experimenter 1 would hide an object at the first location in the sandbox here, and then she would leave the room, and in her absence, experimenter 2 would enter and relocate the object to location number 2. So, following the procedure in the original task to ensure that the children wouldn't keep fixating the object's location to remember it for their search. There was a distractor task here too, when experimenter 1 was re-entering the room, where children were asked to find items in a picture book for 30 seconds. And then the child was asked where the object is and should retrieve it from the sandbox, in our case, with a stick that attracted the object. An egg with a magnet inside, which the children liked very much. So Okay, again, here we would expect to find an altercentric bias from the actual to the believed location. So to ensure that such a bias didn't simply result from, example, from a bias in the middle of the box or something like that, we of course had a control condition in addition to the false belief condition where the main experimenter did not see the relocation and therefore had a false belief. We also had a true belief condition where exactly the same happened except that the main experimenter stayed present during the relocation, so she knew where the object was. Okay, in this study we find evidence against an altercentric bias in children, but when we split this sample in groups with the children passing the standard false belief task and children not passing it, we find evidence for an altercentric bias in the passers and evidence against an altercentric bias in the non-passers. So children who pass standard verbal false belief tasks show altercentric biases, and children who don't pass don't. To summarize, so adults only showed an altercentric bias when they had been asked to reason about the agent's belief in a previous task, and only children who could explicitly reason about others' beliefs showed an altercentric bias. So from our studies, we can conclude that altercentric biases may depend on explicitly reasoning about the other's belief. So far, so good. But if altercentric biases depend on explicitly reasoning about the other's belief and only emerge when children begin to pass verbal false belief tasks, what is with those altercentric findings in infancy that we heard before? So also, we can add findings to this list from our lab too. My colleague Annalena Tebbe conducted an eye-tracking experiment with 9 and 18-month-old infants, and they showed videos in which an agent observed an object moving to one of 2 possible locations. Subsequently, the agent did not witness, so had a false belief, the object's change in location, and the object then either reappeared from the reality congruent or incongruent location. They predicted that infants' expectation of the object's location would be modulated altercentrically, meaning that infants represent the object's position based on the agent's belief. Indeed, her results showed that younger infants showed greater pupil dilation when observing the object reappearing from its actual location, whereas older infants showed the opposite pattern with greater pupil dilation to outcomes violating reality, consistent with recent findings. So this indicates that infants may have an early but receding altercentric bias. To learn more of this interesting infant study, check out her poster in the session afterwards, today at 2:30. Okay, so taken together, these findings suggest that young infants have a strong altercentric bias that then decreases somehow in the second year of life. Young infants cannot act on the world yet and strongly depend on others, so this bias might help them to understand others in the beginning, whereas they then become more able to act on the world and their own perspective becomes more important. And as the ability to understand different perspectives then develops around 4 years, an altercentric bias seems to come back, but now may be more dependent on the context, and in particular the relevance of the other's belief in the context, so possibly leading to a more balanced relation. But I will leave the further interpretation to Olivier, who will now follow with this discussion. So thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, and also, of course, thank you to my research group and my supervisor, Charlotte.
And we have some time for questions. And I just wanted to say, giving the priority to junior researchers doesn't mean, of course, that if there aren't any questions by junior researchers, the senior researchers don't have the floor.
Thank you. Hi, yeah, thank you for the really interesting talk. So, based on the many other talks we've also had about theory of mind at this conference, and you mentioning that this altercentric bias might decrease after infancy and during toddlerhood, kind of, do you believe that this is linked to the development of a self-concept and self-recognition, like we've discussed? So I think you didn't address this directly, but is this, do you see this as part of the explanation, or do you think there's something else going on?
I think it's definitely a possibility. So from my data, of course, that is not the age group where the self-awareness or self-concept develops, because with 3, that is already there. But I definitely would assume from the other data that we heard that this is a very plausible explanation. But yeah.
Thank you.
Would you think that if the 4-year-olds that passed the false belief task seem to have used the computation of belief to be biased by the location in the sandbox, it was based on belief? I mean, we have the same term, an altercentric bias, for everything that we're talking about. But in Southgate's proposal, at least, it was sort of before belief in the case of infants, right? So it was just an influence by gaze cueing some location. Whereas for 4-year-olds that passed the false belief task, it seems to be influenced by the belief computation. So it's just a case that we have the same term for 2 things, right?
I think that is a very good question.
That's how I would see the thing now. Sorry, it was supposed to be a question, but turns out it wasn't.
Yeah, I think that is a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to it, because I think it is a possibility that we witness 2 things that are something different and look the same. I think it is a possibility that we witness something that is somehow constant in a U shape. I think the same goes for the adult data when you link that to infant data. So that's definitely very interesting. I think it's very difficult to examine because of the testing procedures that infants can or cannot do. But for sure, very interesting is something that I'm interested in also. But I'm afraid I don't have a good answer.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely food for thought. I think I might have asked you this before, but I just invite you to speculate. You briefly mentioned that it might, that the altercentric effect might depend on the ability of explicit belief reasoning. So I guess I would just invite you to speculate whether it's the ability or the activity, or so the context, right? Because I think there also they do this task first. So of course you don't know from this, but what do you think? What do you favor as interpretation?
Super interesting. Actually, something that we are following up on. So the question, of course, is in the adults we only see them if we let them explicitly reason before they do this altercentric version, and then we see an altercentric bias. In the children, actually, in our study, they also do an explicit false belief reasoning task beforehand. So I don't have an answer with the data sample we have, but it is something super interesting which we are looking into. So we will now conduct a study where they don't do any explicit reasoning before, and I hope that I will have the next time an answer to that very interesting question, if it is necessary to prompt that somehow in the children too.
Then let's thank Marie one more time.
Thank you.